You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in. We were really...
a Mamma Mia podcast.
Hi, I'm Mia Friedman and welcome to No Filter. One day in 2011, Loren O'Keeffe went to work, and by the end of that day, pretty ordinary day she thought, her life was literally never the same. She got a phone call from her parents saying that her brother was missing. She was the second youngest, there were 4 in the family, and Dan was the baby, 3 girls and a boy. And Dan and Loren had always been sort of partners in crime. She knew he'd been struggling. She knew that he was suffering from depression. They talked about it a lot, and she was doing everything that she could to support him, as the whole family was. But still, that one day, he went missing. And from that moment, Loren's whole life became about finding Dan. She quit her job. She established a Dan Come Home community, a Facebook page, and later she founded the Missing Persons Advocacy Network. It's the only charity of its kind in Australia, and it's one that she's worked absolutely tirelessly for, helping the families of missing persons in a way that no government agency ever has. Meeting Loren is pretty extraordinary. I'd seen her on TV, I'd heard her interviewed, and I'd always been struck by, well, on a superficial level, how absolutely drop-dead gorgeous she is. Also, just how beautifully she spoke about her brother, but also how kind of composed she was. She's always seemed, in every media appearance I've seen her do, very sort of centred and very focused. What I didn't expect was how sort of effervescent and full of life and laughter she'd be. I went downstairs when she arrived at the office to record the podcast, and as part of an MPAN campaign called Two Short Stories, there are these billboards going around the Melbourne CBD with big artistic images of some people who've been missing for a long time. And she and I posed in front of that billboard, and her girlfriend, MK, took the pictures of the two of us together. And when we came back inside and when we started to talk about Dan, her beautiful, smiling, sunny face just suddenly changed. And I could see she was just really thrown back into the 5 years that she spent hoping desperately, desperately, desperately that he would be found, that every email she opened, every comment that she read on the Facebook page, every phone call to the hotline that she or a member of her family picked up, that would be the answer, that would be the missing piece of the puzzle that would help them find Dan. And then a few months ago in March, Dan was found, but not in the way any of them ever hoped. He was found by his father underneath their house. And it turned out Dan had never actually left the house that day, and that he'd been there all that time. And that raised just as many questions as it answered. This is an extraordinary story from an extraordinary woman. You are even more gorgeous than you are on television.
Oh, Mia, stop.
I know. I first wanted to say I'm so sorry about the loss of your brother.
Thank you.
You are so much defined and shaped by him and his absence, aren't you? From the moment he left, you became his champion and have remained so even beyond the point where he was found, and you realised that part of that journey had come to an end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm his big sister, and he has given me this job, of which I love. So it would be such a shame to stop doing the work that we've been doing for the last 5 years, just because our family's, chapter in that sense has sort of, been resolved. There are so many families out there that need that sort of support, and I'm very fortunate to be in a position to try and do that.
I was watching you just when we were talking before, and you were laughing, and obviously every time I've seen you on television and I've heard you interviewed, you've been very solemn, mm-hmm. because it's been a tragedy having Dan missing and then having him found. And then when we started speaking, you straight away switched, and I saw your face just straight away switch. Is it hard? Tell me about that switch. Like, is it hard to I don't know, be defined by something that's so tragic, and that the part of you that is happy and joyful and in love or whatever. How do you balance those two things?
It is really difficult because I've always been a very bubbly, happy person.
Yeah, you are.
And then when Dan disappeared 5 years ago, all of a sudden I felt like that personality that had been so natural to me my whole life was no longer appropriate. You know, I couldn't smile. You know, if I was out, even going out and socializing felt weird. It felt really odd for the first good 6 months. I just didn't want to be in a setting where people were happy. Like, how could you possibly be happy when my little brother is missing?
Like, how is the world still turning?
Exactly. So I really struggled with that, and still do with identity, because I am, you know, forever Dan's sister, publicly, which is strange because I don't have my own sort of sense of self outside of the work that has come from his disappearance, which I understand and I appreciate. And again, like, I feel fortunate to be in a position like this and find the work so rewarding. But it's a challenge.
It's like having to maintain that public face of grief in a way.
Exactly.
I mean, not that you would ever get over it, I imagine.
Oh, no, gosh, no. Couldn't ever. But the important thing to remember is that there are beautiful, amazing, incredible things that came out of it whilst Dan was still missing. For our family and for the community, and very much bigger picture, and that still happens now. So I do more and more. I'm letting myself appreciate those beautiful things and be happy about what we've achieved and the changes we've made as a collective.
So you were 26 or 27 when Dan went missing.
26.
And how old was he?
24.
There are 4 kids in your family.
Yes,
and there's twins somewhere. Is there?
Oh. My cousins.
Oh, I made that up. I thought there was twins. Is there 2 girls and 2 boys? No,
so it goes my elder sister.
Good, I've read my research.
Then our other older sister, then myself, and then Dan was the baby, and he was the only boy. So 3 girls and a boy. I knew there was something special about the configuration. Yeah.
You guys were always super close. Is that because you were the 2 youngest?
Yeah, and we're very close in age. Like 2.5 years is pretty tight. Whereas our older sisters, they were closer in age, and naturally, when there are 4 kids, I think you do sort of pair up. And we had our team, and they had their team, and so now that loss of my little sidekick is really felt in the family dynamic. Like, I don't think people understand how much, and this is, for any family that loses one of their children, it really, the shift in the family is huge. Every Christmas feels different. Every, anything special.
The empty seat at the table.
Yeah. So it's, we're a close family, so it's impacted all of us greatly in different ways. But, yeah.
When did you first become aware that he was struggling?
It's hard looking back because I moved overseas when I was 18, and I did the whole travelling thing all through my early 20s. Whereas Dan was, those few years below me. So he was still in school, and then he did his gap year, and then I wasn't living with him in his late teens and early 20s. I saw a lot of him when we were both living in Melbourne in our 20s. But it may have been that he had been struggling silently in his late teens, but I first really became aware of it when he was probably 22, 23.
Because he told you, or because you noticed?
I noticed, and then shortly after I noticed, he told me. He was very open with everything. We were very close, so he had no qualms about, opening up to me about anything. So he was very proactive about it. He read everything he could. Thankfully, he was never interested in alcohol or drugs, or he didn't smoke. Like, he was the most wholesome guy. So he turned to therapy. He had a psychologist. He was reading. He was doing meditation. He was doing everything he could to try and get through his depression and anxiety, but nothing seemed to be working until eventually he decided to take medication, as everyone had been encouraging him to do, but because he was so purist, he didn't want to turn to meds. And
a lot of people feel like that. They feel like they don't want to. They're worried about that it might change
exactly
who they are or their personality.
Yeah, he didn't like the feeling. So, but to, I guess, appease all of us, he went along with it. And, it was the last resort. He'd tried everything else for a long time. And then, it was shortly after that
he disappeared. Is there a correlation, do you think, in hindsight between, because they say that the period after starting medication, you have to be closely supervised, because if something's going to go wrong, sometimes it can go wrong during that time?
Absolutely, I think there's a correlation. Dan was living in Melbourne with his girlfriend, and he went down to Geelong to visit mum and dad for a few nights, and he'd left his medication in Melbourne. So he went either 2 or 3 nights without it, which would have made it very difficult for him to sleep. And then sleep deprivation is the things that can happen are pretty serious. And so I absolutely think there's a correlation with the medication.
The day that he went missing, where were you and how did that unfold for you?
I was at work.
What did you do?
I was an online comms advisor at the Department of Education. And so it was Friday, which was always frantic. So I was at work, busy all day, hadn't had a chance to call or text Dan, which was unusual because we, at that point when he was really struggling those few months before he disappeared, and we'd been on the phone, a lot, multiple times a day. But that Friday was so hectic that I hadn't had a chance to communicate with him. And then it wasn't until that night, so Friday night, got home from work, Mum called about 7 and asked if I'd heard from Dan, and I said no. And then it was 2 hours later that she called police and reported him missing. And we knew that it was serious because he hadn't turned up to teach his class. And Dan was a super loyal, no matter how bad a day he was having, he would never let his kids down. So he was teaching martial arts at his business outside of Melbourne, and he didn't rock up at 7, and that's when we knew that something was wrong.
And then what was it like? I've often wondered what it's like when you call the police and report someone missing. What happens then? Do they turn up? Do the sirens wail?
That's the thing. We have these expectations that have been set out through TV and movies.
Yeah.
And they're dangerous because they're so unrealistic. I wasn't there. Obviously, Mum and Dad made the call to the police in Geelong, but I think the idea was that they were going to come out and collect a photo. And that...
To do what with?
I don't know, put it on their system, I guess. Okay. But again, because Dan was an adult male and it was non-suspicious, had he been a criminal, had he made it clear that he had bad intentions that day, they, I think, would have acted in more urgency.
When you say bad intentions, had he expressed suicidal thoughts? Had he said he was going to do something bad?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Well, I was thinking more like if he was a bad guy, if he wasn't such a nice guy and he had gone off, and said, I'm going to bloody, kill someone.
Or rob a bank or something. Okay, then it would have been.
Exactly. But, 85% of missing persons cases do pertain to mental illness, and that, the fact that Dan was struggling was made very clear to police. But again, they're under-resourced. There are, 100 Australians every day that are reported missing.
100.
So, yes.
So they go, and I guess the priority are always children.
Of course, children, elderly people, and mentally impaired.
Yeah. And so then they turned up at the house, they got a photo, took a statement, looked around?
Didn't turn up at the house. They came on so that was a Friday night. They came on the Sunday.
Oh my goodness.
And I think that was in direct response to the fact that we'd plastered Geelong with posters everywhere and that the media had started picking it up, and that's when they sort of came to...
So you took matters into your own hands straight away?
We had to. We had asked... I was frantically running around the neighbourhoods because our mum and dad's house is it's on a hill and it borders 2 different suburbs, and so I was running around door knocking with a photo of Dan, asking every person in both suburbs if they'd seen Dan between 9:30 and 10 a.m. the previous day, and I'd asked for some people on the ground to help me, so constables. They weren't able to help us, so it was just myself, my then partner, Dan's girlfriend, and my sister. So we were frantically running around, putting up posters, door knocking, and we knew that because Dan wasn't a suspicious case, police weren't really able to do much more than they did, which was not a lot. But
had you guys talked through, when you say you were knocking on doors and showing his photo, had you talked through, okay, what do we think he might have done, or where do we think he might have gone? Like, you must have theorised.
Oh, yeah. And
Tried to get in his head. Is that what you do?
You do, but you're not thinking clearly. You're not
Yeah.
sleeping, you're not eating. Everything's like, it is the most frantic scenario you can't imagine. You know, a loved one just suddenly disappearing is not something anyone is ever prepared to find themselves in. So we were thinking, okay, he must have gone out the back door, so therefore, you know, Wandana Heights is where we've got to focus, and then maybe that highway. So then we got onto the trucking PA systems and had them put out an alert, and we had, you know, we're getting in touch with all the hospitals in Victoria, South Australia, and New South Wales. We were getting in touch with men's shelters. We were getting in touch with, you know, all kinds of contacts, institutions that we thought might be relevant. But the whole thing was completely out of character. Dan had never done anything like this before. We knew that he was struggling. You know, my sister and I walked out to the paddocks around Mum and Dad's house and the parklands in case, you know, he had taken his life, but we didn't find him. So we kept going. We were, you know, making calls to everyone that we could think of until the third day we decided we couldn't keep it, you know, close to the community anymore. We had to go out bigger, and we reluctantly started the Facebook page on day 3.
Why do you say reluctantly?
Back in those days, Facebook was a different place, you know, like I had never seen a page for a missing person. It was,
true.
you know,
It's
it was
a groundbreaking
athletes and
idea,
celebrities
actually.
and,
Yeah.
you know, news. It wasn't anything to do with social causes, really, and especially
Yeah.
not missing people. You know, you have to physically like a page, and it felt so bizarre to me that we were encouraging people to like the fact that my brother is a missing person. Like, it just was so strange.
So how did you think of it?
Well, it was the only means really that I was familiar with in reaching. I mean, I wasn't huge on Twitter, but we started a Twitter account that day. And it was just, we knew we needed people power. We knew that we didn't have police resources because Dan's case wasn't suspicious. So it was the only option really was social media. And so it spread like wildfire. I mean, Dan is easy on the eye, which certainly helped.
Beautiful, beautiful
and
man.
yeah, and so we were very fortunate. I mean, we had some celebrities tweeting his poster, like one of the Kardashians jumped on board. We had like Hugh Jackman, and it was insane, you know.
And is that
like,
when the media inquiry started to come in?
Yes. Yeah. So they had started coming in like very localized, like Geelong Advertiser. And then we had to make sure that our sister, the middle sister, Kate, she was actually in Europe at the time. So we had to decide at what point we were going to call her to tell her Dan was missing, because we didn't do it in the first, 24 hours in case we found him and he came home and he just needed a breather and then he was home, and then we didn't want to ruin her holiday. So it sounds strange, but, we thought we'd give him a day in case he just needed to breathe. But then I think it was shortly after the 24-hour mark that we called Kate, and she flew home from France, and that's when the media blew up.
And how was it decided that it would be you that would be the sort of the family face and voice for Dan?
I don't think it was decided. I think it just naturally happened that way. Mum and Dad were understandably distraught, completely paralysed, in shock and grief, and my response, I guess, was a bit more proactive. Like, I asked the police that day, I said, so what do I do? Like, how do I find him? And they just said, do whatever you feel like you need to do. And I was like, what does that mean?
Give me a bit more specific.
Exactly. So I was just running out there with no idea, but just trying to contact every single human being I could. And so naturally it just happened that I guess I became the face. I was very fortunate to have a very supportive partner who never put any pressure on me to go back to work, because I quit my job. I mean,
straight away.
It completely consumed me. And I was lucky in a sense that I could just focus. I didn't have, kids that I needed to, feed or anything. So I was in a position that it made sense for me to be the one.
So after the adrenaline of those first few days and even couple of weeks, when does it become apparent that this is going to be a long haul? There is no quick, easy answer.
I think it was the first anniversary.
The first year that adrenaline went for.
Because the thing about that sort of scenario is that it's very fast-paced and it's urgent and it's frantic, and you can feed off that adrenaline. And then, and because it's recent, you know, it still feels, it's only been a couple of weeks, it's only been a couple of months, like maybe he's on a journey and he'll come home soon. But then when it got to the year anniversary, I remember being distraught over the fact that it was no longer weeks or months. I had to say he's been missing a year, and it just felt much more long-term. And I guess at that point we'd already had so much had happened in that first year. So much happened in every one of the 5 years. But I still had enough adrenaline to keep going because we did have such enormous public support. You know, I had people all over the country that strangers, complete strangers, like printing out A3 colour posters of my brother and putting them up at their work, putting them at the train station, you know, driving around with bumper stickers on their car for a guy that they didn't even know. So all of that is what kept me going.
You say so much happened every year for 5 years. That sounds so interesting because there was a sighting. Tell me when the sighting happened.
So
how many years in was that?
That was 6 months in.
Oh, 6 months in.
Yes, not even. It was 5 months. So it was actually it's crazy how it all happened. A girl that I went to uni with in Japan years ago, so probably 2 years before Dan disappeared, or even maybe 3 or 4. Lucy Ormond, she was working at the Colac Herald when Dan disappeared, and Colac is very close to Geelong, and we thought maybe, you know, there'd been a possible sighting out that way. So Lucy had heard about it, done a story, made it front page news in Colac for those, you know, first few days, which was wonderful. And by the time 5 months had rolled around and we decided as a family that we needed to amp it up a bit, we announced a reward for information. And so Lucy, she'd asked me, I think through your direction, to write a piece. She was working at Mamma Mia by then. Yeah. So she asked if I could write something for Mamma Mia, which I did, and that article just blew up and was read by the producer of the project. And so at that point, for those first 5 months, it was really difficult to get media outside of Victoria because it was, you know, it's a local, you know, it's a community issue, so they focus on the local news. And then when we had the interest from the project, it was the day that we announced this $50,000 award. They came to my apartment, went to the Channel 10 studios, and it was nationally broadcast. A woman in Queensland that night had asked her husband to record it because there was a segment about sustainability that she wanted to see. So she got home from work and watched the whole episode and thought, oh my gosh, that guy, that missing man from Victoria, is the guy that came into my medical clinic 2 weeks ago. So her and her colleague, so she called her colleague, they went onto our website, went through all the photos of Dan. They were both convinced it was him. They then did what they thought was the right thing to do, and they called Crime Stoppers. And Crime Stoppers, I don't know if, I think they took a note of it, but nothing was followed up until 3 weeks later. She called Crime Stoppers back with her reference number and said, look, I want to know if Daniel O'Keeffe has been found. And Crime Stoppers said, look, it's none of your business. It's a police issue, da-da-da-da-da. And so she, thankfully, then got in touch with us directly through our hotline and told us everything. It was uncanny. I mean, this guy was physically the match, you know, to Dan. He said his name was James, which is Dan's middle name. He was the right age. He said he was from Melbourne.
It must have felt like Christmas.
Oh, it was insane. Like, he had been offered money and politely declined. You know, everything. This particular clinic was Dan's girlfriend's GP up in Queensland. So all of it. Like, we didn't fall. This was the only sighting that we really truly believed in.
Yeah. So other sightings reported?
Every day.
Because he didn't look hugely uncommon. Like, it could
very
have been
generic.
easily to feel like you'd have seen
very
him somewhere.
Generic. Absolutely. So we were very conscious of that. But this particular one, you know, there were just so many points that this woman had noted from that, and it was 10 minutes. It was 10 minutes face to face. He had asked for a glass of water. They were chatting. So it wasn't like a lot of the sightings that were, I was driving down the highway and I saw a guy with his thumb out and he had brown hair. I think it was Dan. And so, you know, it was exhausting picking and choosing the ones that we'd look into. I mean, there was one in somewhere out Whoop Whoop in like WA, and this guy that looked like Dan was drinking a chocolate milk in the park one afternoon. I was like, oh my God, Dan loved chocolate milk. It's Dan. And so I was like calling up all the local shops to try and get CCTV. And I spent a whole day like liaising with this town trying to get them. I was sending through the post and saying, I think my brother's been there. You know, I spent so many hours
chasing down dead ends. But did clairvoyants get in contact with you?
Oh, of course, yeah.
And how did... What's your belief system, and did you feel that... did you pursue any of them?
I never pursued them.
I mean, I imagine you'd be desperate, and
you are desperate.
Anyone that
and you're
wants
vulnerable.
to help.
Families are very vulnerable, and there are certain people in
Who
society
prey
that prey. There are others that genuinely believe that, you know, they are helping, which is fine. I never I never went out there seeking it, but we had a number of psychics give their opinions.
And what did you do with that information?
Nothing. I didn't. Yeah. I think for some members of the family, it was nice to think, you know, some would say great things, some would say horrible things.
So some would say he's gone, and others would say he's in this town.
Exactly. It starts with
wherever.
an I, and there's a bridge, and there's a tree by the bridge, and that's where he is, and he's going to come home in 4 years. Like those ones to me, but you know, we are vulnerable, and I'm not a mother in this predicament. I'm the sister. So for Mum, I can't imagine how hearing those types of words would affect her. But we all had a lot of hope the whole way through, and that's what kept us going.
Over the 5 years, how did you centralise communications? Like, I imagine there would be a lot of logistics just in terms of the family. Did you communicate every day, several times a day? And how did you maintain that?
Probably the first month I was down in Geelong. So I lived with my then partner in Richmond in Melbourne, but as soon as it all happened, I was Geelong based and had pretty much turned Mum and Dad's kitchen into a media hub. So I had, 5 laptops and all of the phones, because we had a hotline that came later on. So we had as many people on as many different devices as we could. Dan's girlfriend, my sisters, my partner, my friend, you know, cousins. So Mum and Dad's house was kind of like the center point until people had to go back, you know, to their own lives. Which for me was a bit different because I didn't have the family and the career that I'd been working. You know, I had a job, but I was able to let go of that because Dan was far more important. So then after probably the first month, I moved back up to Melbourne, and it was the dining table in my tiny apartment. You know, I had my laptop. I was in my dressing gown pretty much every day because there was no time to get changed.
No.
There were too many emails to write, too many phone calls to make. Like, I would have an idea at 3 a.m. I'd be like, okay, well, he had been reading The Art of Happiness and he had just seen the Dalai Lama 4 weeks before he disappeared. So maybe he is going around Australia, staying in these monasteries. Like, so I would, you know, launch this Tibetan Buddhists, you know, they're the target. So I even went to a few around the country at different points. But
and you spent a lot of time looking for him in parks and talking to homeless people, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. Huge number of, Queensland. So after that sighting, I went up there that day. I jumped on a plane, went straight there, rocked up at that clinic completely unannounced because I knew that if police had become involved that they might not allow me to see the CCTV. I knew that there was CCTV and I wanted to see it. And previously police had been quoting the Privacy Act and saying we can't see the footage even if it is Dan, blah, blah, blah. So I didn't want to allow that to happen. So I just rocked up and hoped I could, you know, charm the manager of the clinic into letting me see it, which thankfully she did. And so I was up there then for the next 2 months and I was doing lots of local media. I was going to every park at all hours of the day because the soup kitchens, like the food vans, they start at 5 a.m. for breakfast. So I'd be going around to the parks I had 2,000 business cards printed with Dan's likeness on the front, then all the details on the back, and I was giving them out to homeless people and volunteers and all sorts of community figures. I'd go to church groups and talk to huge, groups of people in case they'd seen Dan. I was putting up posters everywhere, and it's exhausting.
When you spoke to groups of homeless people and you were in the soup kitchens, what was their reaction? Were they helpful? Were they dismissive? Were they...
Oh, it was a mixed bag. Some people really, they wanted to help, but...
what did you say?
Well, they were leading me down the sort of... they... I don't know, I guess it was an interesting scenario for them. And I think some of them just kind of... I don't know, they would tell me, I saw there was a guy just like this and he was at the, this street corner last week and I think he said he was going to go to the sausage sizzle next Friday, so maybe you should go there. And so, of course, I did because I was that vulnerable and maybe they're right, but, nothing came.
Because there would have been a lot of mental illness among the homeless people that you saw.
Which was confronting as well.
Yeah.
Because Dan... although I was aware that he was struggling before he disappeared, I could never see him living that life. One of the tangents that I think it was The Age took fairly early on was that Dan could be living on the streets. And anything is plausible because it's all crazy because none of this is like Dan. So maybe he was. And so then, for those 5 years, I'd be walking past people on the streets and tearing up because I'd think maybe that's, Dan over on the other side of the country who's cold and unwell and hungry and asking for money. And it just, I wonder how many of the people that we see on the streets have sisters out there and parents wondering where they are. So that's a whole other chapter of work that I'll be focusing on later down the track. But yeah, the homelessness theory was just as plausible as all the other ones. So there was a very strong focus on that community for those 4.5 years.
Did people in your life or people that you met, did some people tell you to just let him go or let it go and move on? Did some people try to sort of say it's not likely that you'll find him, or was everyone very encouraging?
Anyone in my immediate circle would know not to dare.
Not to dare, yeah. Like I would have never
like
said that to you.
So I didn't have any of that from
close people.
No, but there were certain people in the realm. So it's a very niche area, missing persons. Yeah, and so I would kind of I am that annoying one that would invite myself to conferences all around the country and since the world, rocking up just to learn what I could about it because there wasn't enough information given to me and my family when it happened to us. So I wanted to learn, and some of the academics and other professionals in that space over the years would say things that sort of hinted at that, it's very unlikely that you're going to find him because it had become a long-term case. So after that after that 1 year mark, I was like, okay, people are giving up, but I'm not going to give up. And so they would hint at it, but I didn't let it get to me because they don't know what it's like. They might be professionals and, understand the theory and all the research behind it, but until it happens to you, you don't know the drive and that energy that you can find when it's your own loved one. So I never paid any attention to those.
You said you were in a long-term relationship before, and your partner was very close to Dan as well.
Yeah.
How did the two of you navigate that? Because I imagine it so completely all-consuming for you. How did she cope with that?
Ruth's a very patient person and was very close with Dan as well.
Yeah.
So Dan and I would speak on the phone a number of times a day, and then it would get to a point and he would know that we'd reached the point, and then instead of calling me, he'd call Ruth. And so it could be 3 a.m. and Dan's calling Ruth. And but I was really glad that they had that special relationship as well. So she was very supportive when I dropped everything to try and find Dan, because she, like all of us, wanted him home. So I was very, very lucky to have that kind of support. And financially, again, not having children, And, you know, those financial stresses. I mean, it wasn't easy to not have an income for, you know, those few years, but, you know, certainly having a partner that supports that and never put any pressure on me to go back to work, paid work, was, yeah.
Could the two of you have any semblance of normal life during those 5 years, or was everything on hold and was every conversation about Dan?
It was very difficult. I remember it was, I think, our 6th anniversary, and we had planned a nice day out. And then I had a call from Mum, and we were on our first wherever we were going, and Mum called and said, oh, you've got to come down. Channel 7 are on their way. They're doing a piece about... they'd had some sort of hoax email come through, and, you know, people that had Dan and they were torturing him, and they needed $100,000 to let him go and all this kind of crap. So Mum and Dad, they knew it was a hoax, but again, that vulnerability changes people. So so we had to turn around, drive down the highway to Geelong, and I felt terrible, but there was no way out of it. And that happened a number of times. And yeah, I mean, Dan was my number one. And so, you know, she'd gone from being, I guess, the number one in my life to then all of a sudden having to settle for second place, which I can only imagine was extremely difficult. But again, you know, it was 7 years, and we have so much respect for each other, and always will.
When did you guys call it break up?
It was 3 years ago.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about in your work now with MPAN,
Yes.
Missing Persons Advocacy Network.
Correct.
You must see the toll it takes on relationships and on families. Is it something that does cause families to split up and relationships to end, the pressure of a missing person, or does it bring you closer together? How does it...
It can do both, like many big events in life. And every family is different, every case is different. But, I mean, this changes people's lives in so many ways. Like, I've known a lot of people that I work with who've lost their jobs because they, you know, they had to go back to work, but they couldn't because their son was still missing, so they were still out there, you know, and you can't just expect an employer to keep paying you without rocking up. So it's really difficult. So people lose their jobs. I mean, the financial stress on families on top of the emotional trauma is enormous, and that is the focus of our organisation, is very much on giving families practical support. So if there are financial obstacles, like, for instance, if that sighting in Queensland had happened but I couldn't afford the flight up to Queensland that day, to think that I might not have been able to follow up that lead that I so believed in would have crushed me, you know. Yet I know that there would have been plenty of planes going from Melbourne to Brisbane that day that had empty seats that easily, you know, a family actively searching for a missing loved one could take. So
tell me what MPAN does and how it works.
Yes, so I founded MPAN about 3.5 years ago, and like I just said, the focus is very much on providing families of missing Australians practical support. So helping them with if they want certain types of targeted media, like being the connector with the journalists, like writing up the releases, sending out the releases on their behalf. I mean, you're not thinking clearly when a loved one disappears, so you need that sort of assistance, and that's what we didn't get when Dan disappeared. When I asked the police what to do and they couldn't give us any direction, I just thought that's insane. Like, 100 Australians go missing every day, and there's no guidance of what the families are supposed to do. Like, how is it that in this day and age, when there are YouTube tutorials for how to put on mascara and how to, like, tie a shoelace, there was nothing on what to do.
Not even a pamphlet.
Not even a bloody pamphlet.
That's extraordinary.
I just couldn't stand for it. So.
But also just completely inefficient. I mean, if 100 people have the same problem every day of earth-shattering proportions, and it's a problem that's not going to be finished in an hour, you would put an infrastructure in place.
Yeah.
So you've had to do that yourself.
So over the first 2 years that Dan was missing, because of the enormous and unprecedented public support, we had other families of missing persons, not just even in Australia, from all over the world, asking for advice and what to do and how to get that sort of campaign for their loved one. And so I started jotting down. I'd go to the library in Richmond and try and allocate, you know, 8 hours, which is tricky because there were so many distractions. Like the hotline, would ring and I'd have to follow up a possible lead in, Queensland or wherever. So it was difficult, but I jotted down all of the things that I thought were really essential for families to know without bombarding them with too much text. And so I sort of compiled this sort of messy Word document that I wanted to turn into a website, like a really super streamlined, like user-friendly website so that families could easily navigate, what to do when. And here's a checklist of ideas. Here's some information about how to go about doing those, each of these steps with a built-in database of all the contacts that you need. So all the hospitals, all of the homelessness services, all of the media outlets.
So you did this all off your own bat, in your own time, unpaid, unresourced, out of the goodness of your own heart.
I had a lot of adrenaline.
Say yes.
It was really important to me. Like I still know, I know what it's like. I know what these families need. And because we'd been fortunate enough to get that sort of support from the public, but also the media, I wanted to be able to translate our momentum into, support for the families that don't have, that can't just get a sister to stop everything and leave work. And that's
go
ridiculous to
on
expect. Exactly. That the families should have to go to those lengths. And so I had this idea of translating all of these messy Word documents into a website, and I applied for a grant through Vodafone, and it was all very slapdash because the first criteria was that you had to be a charity, and I wasn't a charity, so I was like, crap, I need to register as
Quick, I need to be a charity.
So in 2 weeks, I was like on the phone to the ATO and the ACNC saying, you need to give me the DGR status because Australia needs a charity like this. Like we are going to offer practical support, we're going to do this and this and this, and I wrote up about 2,000 words arguing my case.
It's
and
such
then
a
in the
no-brainer.
nick of time, right?
Yeah.
In the nick of time, I got this status, which then made me eligible, and I ended up getting the grant. So that was so validating to have from a corporate like Vodafone was fantastic. So that's what really started MPAN. I'd never intended on starting a charity. I just wanted this website out there, and that's how I had to do it. So then I was like, all right, it's real. I'm doing it. And it's a charity, so let's do more. So,
of course.
So then now we've got multiple ongoing campaigns. There was so much momentum behind it. The Dan Come Home movement was so huge that we couldn't just leave it, there. The Missing Persons Guide. So now we've got all sorts of relationships with mobile billboard companies and different media networks and things like that. So that's the type of support that I'm really keen on. Like, understandably, emotional support is a huge part of this as well. And there are a number of different, services across the country.
Counselling service, but this is logistical, practical.
Exactly.
Do this, then do that.
Exactly.
Then.
It's all about the practical. That's been my response with Dan's disappearance, and that's where I feel my experience, lies, and that's what I'm really passionate about. So,
I imagine the first few times the first 100 times probably, you got tips or calls to the hotline. How did you would have had this massive adrenaline spike and hope, and this is it, and then it is a process of those hopes being dashed, and then you fall, and then you go up again with the next one. How do you manage that over 5 years? Do you end up each hope is a little lower than the last one because you've had 300 that didn't go anywhere?
It's a good question. Everyone is different, but for me personally, I believed that the longer he went without being found, the more likely it was he was just traveling around the country and he was going to come home in his own time. So I saw it sort of the opposite way around. Like a lot of people would think in the beginning is when, and I sort of got to a point where I so believed that he was just doing his thing, and Dad believed it too, and Dan was going to come home when he was ready. So the sightings, or the reported sightings, would come in, and it was a huge rush, but the letdown was never so big that it really got to me. I was like, it's all right. Like, there's so much to do. I was so focused on the work. There was so much work to do, especially when it became, I was running the Dan Come Home campaign and MPAN simultaneously. So there's just, it's a 24/7 job for both of them, that there were too many distractions for me to get too caught up in what may or may not have been Dan on the side of the road at that time last Thursday afternoon, So I got used to it because there were so many. Some I could easily brush off, like one's in Tasmania. I was like, oh, it's pretty unlikely. Pretty unlikely. But maybe. And Mum was like, well, you never know. So then, we do a few things here and there. But I got to a point where like I said, like the Queensland one was the only one I really ever truly believed in. So.
Does MPAN have funding now?
No, we don't have, we don't have steady funding. We just had a fundraiser the other week.
And how can people help?
Well, I survived thanks to property. So Ruth and I
because I asked you that. I said, how do you make money? Make money. How do you support yourself? Because everything you're doing is for the greater good.
Luckily, Airbnb. I mean, I had just gotten in at the right time before Dan went missing, and that is how I managed to just stay afloat. But the ultimate goal is, of course, to get MPAN to a point of financial sustainability so that I can eventually, I'd love to get very minimal salary, but I'd love to get a staff member.
Because you work
to get
full-time.
a few staff members. I work full-time, yes. But I'm very lucky to have an office in the city in kind through Senate SHJ. And that's an ongoing arrangement. So I never have to worry about paying, for office space or things like that, which is a huge help. But it's difficult. I was kind of, when Dan was still missing, I was like, all right, I'm just going to keep going at this pace. I can't slow down because there's so much work to do. Now that Dan is no longer missing, I feel like as much as I am forever committed to this cause, I'm not sure that I can maintain the same pace with that, especially without funding. I'd love to, but it's really tiring. I'm so exhausted.
You must be.
So we are open to all kinds. I'd love a partnership with any sort of corporate. I mean, we have so much to offer. We have such rich content. We've got such momentum behind us already. We've got all sorts of sponsorship opportunities. I mean, there are so many different ways. And then individuals as well. Like, donations are wonderful, but people, I really don't want this to fall on, like, funding-wise, the people, because the people are the ones that we need out on the streets, keeping their eyes open, sharing the posters across social media. Like, that's what they do. We need funding through either government or corporate, some sort of private means of funding so that the people, can do their thing and spread the word. I don't want them having to feel like they have to, contribute financially as well. Like, this is a huge community issue that, should be a collaboration between the media and the corporate sector and the public sector as well. But people power is what's going to find people.
And the people who have lost or who have missing loved ones, I imagine you're in a constant state of hearing people's stories and speaking to people who are in great distress.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. My partner and I actually went away a few weeks ago to Daylesford and we just checked into this really beautiful accommodation, and then I had a phone call from a lady who wanted to share her story, and so it was a while. It was like over an hour on the phone listening and, trying to think of ways that we could help her particular case. And, then they'll follow up emails and everything. So everything kind of stops because I engage with these people. And often, because most people are found within a short period of time, my relationship is generally quite fleeting. Like, I'll be very intense with someone for 48 hours or a week, and then they don't need us anymore because their loved one has come home.
Is that what happens often? Tell me about...
Absolutely.
I know you can't generalise, but of the 100 people who go missing every day, how many are still missing?
Well, 95% are found within a matter of days, like 3-4 days. And so
they've just gone to cool off, or they didn't tell someone.
Exactly. And then it's between 2 and 5% that are found later on, like after a month, longer term, and then it's really the last 1-2% that are never found, which is still a huge number of people, like 2 Australians every day. And research has shown that for every one person that goes missing, at least 12 people around that one person are directly impacted, like financially, emotionally, psychologically. So it's hundreds of thousands of Australians every year who are directly impacted by this issue, but there's not yet adequate support for them. So, I'm trying my best, but there's only one of me. I've got a handful of fantastic volunteers, but, there's got to be, we need some more support.
Coming up, what life was like for Loren when Dan wasn't missing anymore.
Hi there, Monique Bowley here. It's hard to find good podcasts, isn't it? Sometimes you scroll through your feed, you think, oh, is it going to be a hit or a miss? You can never quite tell. Luckily, there is a way that you can get just really good podcasts by downloading the Mamma Mia podcast app. It's where all of our brilliant shows live. Shows like This Glorious Mess, Mamma Mia Out Loud, and our latest show, the Mamma Mia Book Club. Shows made by women for women. The Mamma Mia podcast app. It's free, it's easy to use, and it's now available on both Android and iOS. Just search for the Mamma Mia podcast app in your app store.
With what you know now, how do you look back on those 5 years?
We have so thankfully been able to get so much good out of those 4.5 years of family tragedy. We have had many amazing things come from it. I wouldn't be in the position that I am in now, which is, you know, I have a job that I adore. I have people in my life who I adore. I've been able to travel and learn and, you know, experience amazing things all around Australia and the world because of it. So whilst I can imagine people, and that was one of the first things that popped into my head that day, is that, you know, people must think that we feel silly. You know, we went to such great lengths when some people who aren't as, you know, close to the story wouldn't understand that, you know, we did everything that we had to. We thought we had to. We couldn't have tried harder. And like I said, thankfully we have such greatness from this. You know, we created a community. We opened up a platform for others to come and share their own stories of not just, you know, their loved ones going missing. And again, because there's been such taboo around the topic of missing persons forever in Australia. So we've sort of started that conversation. But we also had a lot of people, mostly men, but women as well, writing to us to say, thank you for sharing this, because I had considered going missing myself. I have instead sought treatment for my mental health issue.
Wow.
And I'm in a much better place. And I know, because I've seen the impact it's had on your lives, I know what it would do to my family, so I haven't gone missing. And that's the most rewarding part of all of this, is that Dan has saved other families, you know, the trauma of what ours had to go through.
And so have you.
Wow.
You'll never stop being his sister, will you?
No.
You're still doing a lot for him.
Oh, well, it's all for him. You know, this organisation is his legacy. It's what he's given to the world, and there's still so much more to do.
You're incredible.
And
I was going to ask you about the billboard and about the two short stories campaign.
Yep. So
tell me about that.
Well, like I've said a few times already, 100 Australians are reported missing every day, which is a huge sum of people, and generally the public only really get to hear their vital stats. You know, how tall they are, what colour hair they have. It's nothing really, you know, deep about the person, which is understandable, but it's really, it's a shame, and it's difficult for families, especially when it comes long term, that the public haven't had an opportunity to connect with the person behind that poster.
And I think that's why everyone knew the name Loren O'Keeffe, because of you, because you went out and you made him a person, and he's my brother, he's my little brother, and you determinedly painted this very detailed picture of him that everybody could relate to, and suddenly he wasn't just a statistic, he was a person. Yeah,
exactly. And that took a full-time job, which it should never take a family having to go to those lengths. So what we're trying to do this year for Missing Persons Week is to give families an opportunity to share more about their loved one, rather than just, you know, how tall they are and what colour eyes they have. So we, together with Grey Advertising, we're so fortunate to have them on board, we've come up with a campaign called Two Short Stories, and we've paired 8 Australian families of long-term missing persons with 8 Australian authors to create about 1,000 words of short stories for each, and then that will comprise a book that we're going to publish in a couple of weeks. But it's also, we've paired them with artists who have created beautiful artworks that are being displayed in the locations that these people were last seen for the week. And it's just, it's a fantastic way to engage the public, to show them that, again, that, they have hobbies and they belong to communities and, they have personalities. They're not just those police stats, because so much of what we're trying to do as an organisation is stray from that association that the public have with Crime Stoppers and police and missing persons, because it's not a crime to go missing. Dan didn't do anything wrong. We need to reiterate that this is a community issue, and so by using mediums like art and literature, we're able to open up the minds of the public and bring them in so that they are more inclined to support the cause.
How can people buy Two Short Stories, the book?
Yep, so if they go to our website, which is mpan.com.au, there's on the landing page, there's a link to everything, and we're taking orders. It's really hard to know how many books to get, but I'm really excited. The stories are so beautiful. Actually, one of your writers, Jo Abbey, is on board, and the artwork that these artists have done is just gorgeous. So we've been going around all week displaying them in the locations where these loved ones are last seen, with the families, which has been so powerful, and the billboard that you just saw outside for Owen Redman, who went missing in 91 in Brunswick, which is 25 years ago. And his brother Dylan has been one of, I've been working closely with Dylan for the last few years, and it was so special to see that artwork. It was taken from a tiny little 15 kilobyte image from the late, early 90s, and it was blurry, and it was, an illustrator was able to create this enormous billboard artwork, so striking, and it's been going around the CBD.
Was that the one we saw downstairs before? That was incredible.
Yeah, so Dylan's wrapped. Just before I forget,
tell me.
We were very fortunate to get Sibylla Budd to do our audio recordings for the excerpts of all the stories.
Love
so
her.
We've got, how can you not? She's fantastic.
Dad came to Australia from Italy as a young man, aged around 21. He got work on the Hydroelectric Commission here in Tasmania, and he continued to work as an electrician for the Commission for 36 years. I think he met my mother Jill at a dance, and the rest, as they say, is history. He was a real giver, who loved his family and always tended to think of others before himself. In particular, he loved nothing more than spoiling his grandkids. He was also always there for Nick and me, well into our adulthood. He was right into soccer, and many of my childhood memories are of kicking a ball around with him in the backyard, or of him coming with us and supporting us at soccer games. Another fond memory is of spending time with him in his beloved veggie patch, or watching him building things and tinkering in the yard. Help continue Nicola's story at mpan.com.au.
Families, they need that kind of support, and I just want to be able to do it more and more. But
because it's is it like a living death? That sort of missing, you can't grieve, but you miss them terribly, and they're not there, and then you don't know. I'm trying to put words around it. I wouldn't have a clue.
And even for me, after 5 years, it's still impossible to articulate. But ambiguous loss is considered by psychs all around the world to be one of the most stressful types of grief. That constant not knowing, and prolonged stress has a profound impact on the human brain. So, you start to forget things. My memory, I've noticed myself, I used to be super, great, especially with short-term memory. I'm forgetting things. The other day.
Because of stress. Stress does that.
Because of stress. And especially in the last few months after Dan was found, I was supposed to catch up with a couple of mates in the city after work for a drink, and I had just spoken about it with them a few hours before, and then they called me and they're like, "Where are you?" And I was completely forgot, and that had never happened to me before. So I've started to be more aware of it. My partner's very aware of it and likes to remind me. But the impact, the physical, mental, emotional toll that ambiguity has on families of missing persons is enormous.
When Dan was found, relief is the complete wrong word, so I don't even want to use the word relief, but I'm grasping for the right word. I don't want to be voyeuristic and say, how did you feel? But did it feel different afterwards than before?
So much.
Like, was the
Changes.
vigilance gone? Like,
It's still, I'm still transitioning, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, I still now forget that he's not missing anymore.
yeah.
And it got me yesterday because I had a call from the cemetery asking if we still want to hold the plot next to Dan's. And it just really caught me off guard. And then I remembered what had happened. So when it first happened, the shock was so huge. Like I said, it still hasn't really sunk in. So I guess I can understand that there will be that feeling of relief in a way eventually. But the bigger part of me still kind of misses the hope of him being missing. You know, at least I had hope,
right.
you know,
Missing
and
the
then
hope.
the hope is gone now.
Yeah. And is a lot of the adrenaline gone?
Yes and no. Like, I have families who are really, really energetic and capable, and they come into our office and we're like, okay, media strategy, and we're on it, you know, and that is what I thrive on. So when I deal with those families and those campaigns, the adrenaline is pumping regardless of, you know, what's happened in my personal life. This is my work. And so I get really, really into that. But I think generally now I can say, look, it's 10 o'clock. I'm not going to respond to that email. Unless, if it's urgent, of course I will. My phone is always on. But I can
You need
try
boundaries,
and
Loren.
yeah, I can sort of aim for normal work hours, especially again if it's not urgent. But I don't know. It's still a transition period. Like, I want this. It is my career. But it's strange because I don't have any like qualifications for this career. Like I did.
Oh, yes, you do.
Well, yes and no.
Yes
I don't
and
have
yes. Just yes.
I mean, okay, all right. If a social media page
There's
is like
no
a
one more
CV.
qualified. Like, honestly,
Well.
you should have a doctorate, a PhD. I met your gorgeous partner, MK, downstairs. What was it like falling in love with and becoming a couple with someone who never knew Dan?
It was really beautiful when it was only a few months in. It was like maybe 6 months in. And it may have just been, it would have been time-wise, his birthday must have been. And she said, and I was having birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas is the worst. And it must have been his birthday last year. And she said, this might sound strange, but I miss Dan. You know, and she'd never met him, and but she had been so aware, obviously, of everything, and so from very early on, I have felt that she has known him through me and my family and the work. So there is that connection. It is, you know, I will never stop being upset about the fact that he never got to meet her.
Yeah.
Well, you know, they had time together, but it was very different to what I'd imagined. But I feel like she knows him because he, you know, and especially as I continue with this work, like that's how I keep him close to me. So I want to keep doing this work forever because it is what connects me to Dan, especially now that, you know, he's no longer here.
I'm going to cry now. I'm just going to go off and have a quiet little weep in the corner. Loren, thank you.
Thank you.
You are the most glorious human.
Oh,
Dan
thank you.
will always be very lucky to have you.
We're lucky to have him.
Thanks for listening to No Filter. If this episode has hit home with you and affected you, think about sharing it. Send it to a friend. Send a link. Tell them. The more people that can hear Loren's story, the better for people like Dan and for their families. This podcast was produced by Eliza Ratliff and hosted by me, Mia Friedman. I'll see you next week.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.